Morning. It's good to see you today. Thanks for being here. We're going to talk just a little bit about Moses. So if you'll turn with me over in your Old Testament, go back over to Exodus chapter 1. We'll spend some time in Exodus. What we're going to do is really start off a several-week discussion about things related to the Exodus. And so we're just going to start this morning with some lessons we can learn from Moses. And the way we're going to do it is, in just a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to go first. I'm going to ask you to tell me something you remember about Moses, a lesson we can learn from Moses. I have a list of things, and my list really is at the beginning of Moses' life and the work that he did. But I'd like for you to think as big as you want to think, lessons from the life of Moses. And we're just going to kick off several studies over the next few weeks about the Exodus, things we can learn from it, things we need to dive into and pay more attention to, and so on. It's good to see you. It's good to be back with you. Glad to see some of you haven't been feeling well or feeling a little bit better. Good to see Ben and Riley here always. Thank you for being here. With that, has anyone thought of something about Moses that you would like to mention? A lesson from the life of Moses, what he did well, what he did not do well, something we can learn from. Does anyone want to jump in and start, or do you want me to go first? Anyone have anything? Yes, sir.
Utter reluctance to take his task.
Okay, that is on my list this morning. His complete and utter reluctance to do what he is supposed to do what God called him to do. If you go with me to Exodus chapter 3, that's where it begins with the burning bush incident. And God calls him. You'll remember that there in verse 4. It says, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, that is, to look at the bush, God called to him out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Of course, then that begins the discussion. Ultimately, God says, I'm going to send you to the people. Verse 10, he says, therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses there begins his reluctant response. You have the first one in verse 11, you have the second one in verse 2, you have the third one in chapter 4 in verse 1, you have the fourth one in chapter 4 in verse 10, the fifth one really in verse 13. Moses keeps saying, I'm not the guy. I don't want to do that. So what's a good lesson for us from that attitude and activity there with Moses? What's a good lesson? Okay, I'm not going to say that from up here. Sometimes you have to do what you don't want to do. It's just that simple. We kind of deceive ourselves if we act as if everything God wants us to do, we will automatically, from the depth of our soul, desire to do. It's not true. It's not so that everything he demands of us, we're going to naturally want to do. He is going to demand of us things that we do not want to do. He's going to call us to do things and accomplish tasks that we just really would rather not be involved in sometimes. Think about Acts chapter 9. When the Lord appears to Saul on the road to Damascus, he also appears to Ananias. You remember that? And he said, Ananias, I want you to go see Saul. And what was Ananias' response? This guy kills Christians. He kills people like me. I don't want to go see him. God said, go. There are things going on that you don't know about, Ananias. God said, go. He is a chosen instrument of mine. He's going to do something in a way no one else could do it. I have plans for him. And so you go, not unlike what happens with Moses in Exodus 3. But the way we tend to filter God's requirements of us is through our own experiences up to this point, just like Moses, just like Ananias. We look at our situation, our lives, the way that we have structured them, the habits we have, our personally perceived strengths and weaknesses and all that, and we say, I'm not the person for the job. But our task is to go. That's it. Just like Moses was told, go. That's how God wraps up the discussion with Moses. In verse 14 of chapter 4, it says, the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. In verse 19, the Lord said to Moses in Midian, Go back to Egypt. That's where God says, I've heard enough of your objections. I've listened to them. I've allowed you to express yourself. But what I told you in the beginning is what I'm telling you now. You go. And that principle has a lot of application for us in life, especially life as a Christian. We look around in a local congregation and we see opportunity to help, to participate. And then we say, yeah, but that's not what I want to do. Or I tried to do that and so hurt my feelings about it. Or, somebody else is much better suited for that than I am. And we need to understand that God requires us to do things that we just don't want to do. And the problem is not the not wanting to do them. That is kind of a natural thing depending on personality and what's required. That happens sometimes. The problem really comes when I say I'm just not going to do what I see needs to be done and what I could do. You have any other thoughts about that? Yes, sir.
We see that throughout the text, and I'm reminded of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 1. The business of the way that the gospel is spread and the message of the cross and the agents, we use that term that God uses. He's always chosen man to be the sower, to spread the word. And those men and women have come from all walks of life. Some of them, from the standpoint of who he chose, wouldn't have looked very impressive to us.
Right.
But he's structured it exactly that way to suit his purpose. And we're just supposed to sow our capability, and we lose sight of the fact, and Paul deals with that in 1 Corinthians 3, he's the one that's going to give the increase, not us.
Very good, very good. God supplies the increase, our job's to do the work. And that's essentially what he said to Moses, isn't it? Stop worrying about the details. Stop trying to come up with all the reasons why you shouldn't go. I've got that part under control. Yeah, but I don't talk very well. I have that under control. What do I do if they don't believe me? I have that under control. Go. The opposite of the Moses response and the Ananias initial response, really to me, is in Isaiah chapter 6. In Isaiah chapter 6, that throne scene is there. Isaiah has this vision. And there is a voice that says in verse 8, whom shall I send and who will go for us? Remember that? There's work to be done. There's tasks to be performed. There's a message to be preached. Who's going to go? And what's Isaiah's response? Here am I, send me. Yeah. Now, that is not stated from a position of arrogance, from the standpoint of, I think I'm the best suited for the job. If y'all will get out of the way, I'll go do better than all y'all could do. It's not that. What do you think it is that prompts Isaiah to say what he says, the way he says it? In that context, what do you figure it is that prompts him to say what he says? What he just seen. He has a very clear picture of God on his throne. He has a really good understanding of the majesty of God Almighty. And so his response is not self-centered. His response is God-centered. Most of the time, my reluctance is self-centered. Most of the time, my logic for not doing what I know I should do is self-centered. Isaiah is in the presence of God, and there is no self-centeredness there at all. It is all about God. And so he says, I'll do it. I'll do it. And that's a really good attitude for us. One more time, though, when we're in those circumstances where something we don't want to do is required of us, let's understand that God knows our weaknesses just as well as he knows our strengths, and he can account for that. It's like he did with Moses and Aaron. He can account for that. He can make that work. So that's a good one to start with. Lessons from Moses. He was reluctant to start, completely, utterly reluctant, but he did it. And it worked. What else? Lessons from Moses. Yes, sir.
I think tied really nicely to that, Todd, is that there were times when those that he was having to deal with and sow the seed to caused him to be frustrated and disappointed and angry, and I just need to give up. I didn't beget these people. I mean, there were times in the process that it didn't look like he was going to be successful at all. And
Yeah.
it was frustrating for him. And we're going to be in the same boat.
Very good. One of the things we learn from the life of Moses is that Moses did not know all of the detail about what was going to happen and how it was going to unfold and all of that. His task was to go, much like when God told Abraham to get up and leave your country, leave your family, and go where? What did God say? Where did he tell him to go? To a land I'll show you. Yeah, think about that. Try getting up tomorrow morning and saying to your spouse, get in the car, we're going to go to a land I'll tell you about when we get there. Somebody's going to want to know where we're going and how we're going to get there and when are we going to get there and what's it going to be like when we get there and we're going to eat along the way and all that kind of stuff. We want the details. We want to know how that's going to work. Moses didn't get that. Moses had to go step by step in obedience to God. And he ran into some really difficult opposition. He ran into Pharaoh first of all, but he also ran into the people, right? The initial I want you to let my people go from the Lord to Pharaoh was met with, no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to make it harder for them to do their job, which turned the people against Moses. So at the end of chapter 5, Moses is in a pretty bad spot. You know, the people don't want to do what they're supposed to do. Everybody's kind of worked up, and up to that point, we haven't really been successful. We've performed some miracles, but we haven't really been successful. And Moses is probably, as Dr. Bailey said, in that time where he's doubting, is this really going to work? I'm doing what I think I should do. Is it really going to work? And yes, it's going to work. But even after the Exodus begins, did the people rebel against God and against Moses? Once? More than once. Kind of reminds me of Ezekiel chapter 3. You remember Ezekiel chapter 3? Yeah, turn over there. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 3. Kind of reminds me of that. When the Lord commissions Ezekiel to go preach the gospel, much like he did Isaiah, Ezekiel has vision that we really have a hard time even discussing, much less explaining. The wheel that Ezekiel sees and all the detail associated with it, it is designed to grab attention. It's designed to say this is from God. And really it is almost a prophetic kind of a vision in that it has stuff within it that we don't fully understand, which is going to be the nature of the work Ezekiel has to do. He's going to do work that he doesn't always fully understand. But in his commissioning, verse 1 of chapter 3 of Ezekiel, then the Lord said to me, Son of man, eat what you find, eat this scroll, and go and speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he fed me this scroll. And he said, Son of man, feed your stomach and fill your body with this scroll which I am giving you. Then I ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth. So the idea is you're going to eat this scroll, all right? What does that mean? Well, you're going to take within you my words. That's what God says. I'm going to put my words in you, just like he said to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1. I'll give you the words you need to speak. I will give you my words. So he eats the scroll, and it tastes sweet. The words of God are good and beneficial. That's the idea that he's conjuring up here. And then he says in verse 4 of Ezekiel 3, Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak with my words to them. You give them my words, not your words, my words. Verse 5, for you are not being sent to a people of unintelligible speech or of difficult language, but to the house of Israel. You're going to people who know you. You're going to people who understand who you are. You're going to a bunch of folks that ought to want to hear what you have to say. Do they want to hear what he has to say? They do not want to hear what he has to say. They will have an issue with what he says. It says back in verse 5 of chapter 2, as for them, whether they listen or not, for their rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. God says, look, you're going to go talk to a bunch of people who they're not going to want to hear what you have to say. They're your people. I'm their God. They know me, but they're not going to want to hear this message. So your task is going to be hard. So he tells him to make his face or his forehead hard. What he's saying is, you be just as stubborn as the people you're preaching to. You be just as hard-headed as they are hard-headed. Because, as God says, they are a hard-headed bunch. That's the kind of environment Moses went into. He was dealing with Pharaoh, who was hard-headed, stubborn. We'll talk about him, Lord willing, at the next session. What we're doing now with Moses, we'll take a little look at Pharaoh at the 1045 session. But Moses has tough work ahead. The people are not going to just always go along with what God says through Moses. It's going to be difficult, and he's going to have to deal with that. That is something that sometimes we get to thinking only the preachers and the teachers have to deal with. We see it with the prophets and all that. We get to thinking, man, only those people have to deal with it. No, you have to deal with that. Everybody as a Christian has to deal with the fact that some people are not going to want to hear it. And even some people you love, some people who are close to you, some people who mean so much to you, they're not going to want to hear it. Does that mean you just walk off and say, forget it, I'm done? Well, Moses was not allowed to do that. And Ezekiel was not allowed to do that. What do you do when your task was spreading a message that people, even people close to you, do not want to hear? What do you do? What do you do? Yeah, you keep spreading the message. You keep doing the best you can. Sometimes our logic works a lot like the logic of Moses here at the beginning of his work. And that is, well, it's not working, I probably need to quit. It's not working, this is not going to work. And we need to be persistent. That's what we need to do. So that's a good one. What else? What else? Lessons about Moses. I'll give you one, a simple one, that while you're thinking about another one. Whatever it is that you are going to do for the Lord, whatever it is, and however you're going to serve his cause, you will be able to do that because of the work someone else has already done. Moses comes on the scene because how did things go when Moses was born? What happened when Moses was born that allowed Moses to be who he is in chapter 3 at the burning bush? What happened? Yeah. His wife, his mother and his sister, and then others who were really not on his side were on his side because God put them there. And so when Moses sees the burning bush, Moses has already been through a process that was dependent upon other people playing their part in God's plan. And we need to see our lives like that. Because when we see them like that, it helps us recognize the sense of obligation we have in our time, this short amount of time that we can serve God and God's people. So whatever it is that we can do today, right here at Northside for God and God's people, we are able to do that in part because other people at a previous time did their part. They played their role in God's plan, so we can now play our role in God's plan. And it's really, really valuable for us to see that. And it helps us try to live up to today's obligation with God and his people. If we mess it up, if we don't live up to it, if we let it go, then what does that mean for the next generation, for the next group? They're going to have a harder time, possibly. Maybe God's already factored in the fact that I'm not going to do my part as well as I should and can overcome that. I'm sure he can. But the point is, we are where we are. We discussed this a few weeks ago in part. We are where we are because of what others have already done. Let it be said in future generations that they are where they are because of the work that we were willing to do. Doesn't mean the work is always going to be perfect. It does not mean that we're the only ones who can serve the Lord. That's not what it means. It means we have a role to play in God's plan, and we need to do that. We need to carry out our responsibility. So, there were those before Moses who did their part. Moses comes and he does his. Then who takes over after Moses? Who is it? Joshua. And Joshua was able to do what he did in part because Moses did what Moses was supposed to do. And so after Joshua, jump ahead with me now. In fact, while you're jumping ahead in your mind, turn over to the end of the book of Joshua. After Joshua, and the fact that Joshua did his part and all of that, how did it turn out for the next group? Joshua chapter 24. Kind of a mixed bag. Joshua 24, verse 29. It came about after these things that Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, Verse 31, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. So Joshua carried on the work in good style and did his job, and the people who were contemporaries with Joshua carried on the work and did the work in good style. And then we enter into what time frame in Israel's history? We call it the time of the judges. And things begin to fall apart. One of the things that's been on my mind lately is the fact that it doesn't take very long for things to begin to fall apart. What it really takes is for some folks to just not do their part. That's all it takes. Just a few years of not doing what we ought to do, of not supporting what ought to be supported, of not participating in what we ought to participate in. Just a few years of that, and all of a sudden you have a mess. The time of the judges bears that out. And so that really helps us see, back to Moses, it really helps us see and understand the value of recognizing the fact that people worked before us to bring us to this point, and now this is our time to work so that the next group, the next generation, has something to continue with. Because if we fail, their chances of failure go up dramatically. They can overcome, but why in the world would we put them in that position? So that's what I think about. One of the little lessons from Moses, that what he was able to do was because somebody else did what they were supposed to do, and that's always been God's plan. You know God's plan is never one thing. God's plan is always moving forward. It's always progressive. It's always going from here to the next, to the next, to the next. And we see that all throughout the text, Old Testament and New Testament. One more real quick. You have one more you want to give us? One more lesson from Moses. Anybody have one more you want to throw out? Yes, sir. Yeah, God instructed Moses to speak to the rock. Moses struck the rock, and the consequences were he was not able to enter into the promised land. That one, Brother Medley, has more lessons and things we could discuss than time we have left in this session, but I would imagine, Lord willing, we'll come back to that as we study through the Exodus. That's one of those really simple, short, quick examples of the fact that obedience matters, even in the little things. The point wasn't there, if you remember, the rock. The point was obey God and his blessings can be yours. Do not obey God and there's going to be consequences. We'll come back to that one. That's a really, really good lesson from the life of Moses. Okay, we'll take a little break and then we'll begin our Bible classes. Thank you.